we are completely handicapped on being able to provide any additional military aid to Ukraine since our supplemental funding ran out. And that's why we've requested that Congress pass this urgent supplemental request.
The policymakers, the people who go there who are animated by policy outcomes and principles, are leaving, and what regrettably is oftentimes replacing them are entertainers.
Folks, I'm happy to have been able to forgive these loans because when we realize and relieve Americans of their student debt, they're free to chase their dreams.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Is Nikki Haley an alternative or an annoyance, an insurance policy or a vanity project? Haley says she's the winner Republicans are looking for in 2024, but winners, well, they need to win. Haley will not do that in Saturday's South Carolina Republican primary. That's not our prediction. We don't do such things. That's Haley. She's not predicting victory, only that she will be competitive. South Carolina will reward 50 delegates, 29 to the statewide winner, which very much looks like it will be former President Trump. It will also award 3 delegates in each congressional district. But you must win the district to claim those 3 delegates. There is a very real chance Haley won't win a single district, shut out in her own home state. Not just a loss, but a mathematically brutal one. Currently, Trump leads Haley 63-17 in delegates. After South Carolina, that total could be as high as 113-17. Haley says she's not going anywhere and, for the moment, has the money to back up that long-shot promise. For Trump and Republicans, that means there's no alternative. Or is there? Here in Washington, Trump already looms over elected Republicans, seen on President's Day when House Speaker Mike Johnson chose to spend the long weekend at Mar-a-Lago. Johnson leads the disorganized and very slim House Republican majority with pressure on him to avoid a government shutdown and pass aid to Israel and Ukraine. And that is where we begin. Margaret Brennan and Scott MacFarlane join us now. Margaret, of course, is CBS News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent and the moderator of Face the Nation. Scott is CBS News Congressional Correspondent. Scott and Margaret, I want to play for you something that Patrick McHenry, Chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, very experienced vote counter, close to the House Republican leadership, told me about the pending Senate bill with aid to Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and other matters. Let's play that.
What is axiomatic about the House is that any speaker can stand in the way of a majority will on the House floor for a period of time, but not permanently. And here we have a substantial majority in the House of Representatives that is for the defense supplemental that the Senate passed. They support 80 to 90% of what's in the bill, and about 2/3 of the House is of that opinion. It will get done.
Scott MacFarlane, when you hear Patrick McHenry say we'll get done and a speaker can stand in the way of the will of the House, but not permanently, what does that tell you?
There's such little time, and what Patrick McHenry, I think, is arguing unambiguously is that they're going to find a way to do this with both parties again. Just like they did in September, just like they did in November, they're going to hit a snooze button to temporarily extend spending into 2024 with that same bipartisan coalition that has kept the lights on and the doors open in the federal government. Potentially, the same coalition we saw avert a debt ceiling crisis, and potentially, Major, the same coalition that will be needed to get Ukraine funding and Israel funding. Some of this is going around the Speaker of the House, even though the Speaker of the House is kind of opening the door to let folks in. I was struck in particular late today by the statement from the House Freedom Caucus, the more conservative members of the Republican conference, blasting leadership for not giving enough information on how they're going to keep the government open. What's the spending deal that's going to be passed before March 1st? If they don't know, if they haven't been informed, they're not going to like the outcome. And it seems quite clear the only outcome involves one of two things: a shutdown on this third attempt, or that same bipartisan coalition keeping the doors open.
Margaret, from your perspective, talking to those in the top echelons of the Biden White House and diplomats from across Europe, what is their sense of the next couple, 3 weeks here in Washington? Because a lot of things are really hanging in the balance, not only in international policy, but domestically as well.
We're on a knife's edge, and particularly coming off of the weekend and the gathering in Munich of all of these world leaders, there's this sense of how are they not getting how essential this is, and also once again underscoring the critical role the United States plays not just in funding and leading, but in actually manufacturing weapons. There's a huge bottleneck. You know, Europe, as the EU, just pledged $50 billion, but they can't manufacture quickly enough or efficiently enough to be able to make a difference in the near term the way the United States of America could if they turned on the financial resources that Congress holds the purse strings to here. And that is the problem. So Congress being on vacation, essentially, in the House until March is a very real issue. And the White House National Security Advisor came out yesterday and drew it in stark terms, saying that the loss of this town in eastern Ukraine that Ukrainian forces had to pull out of, giving Vladimir Putin his first significant battlefield victory in some time, is directly related to Speaker Johnson not putting this bill on the floor. Now, he's making his own political prosecution point. Some Democrats quietly say, we wish we got more air cover from the White House on this. Why aren't they coming out and saying, hey, Mr. Republican lawmaker, in your district, they would make this many bullets, and therefore this funding would help? And why not prosecute that case a little harder to make it more uncomfortable for some of these lawmakers to force the speaker? But that's where we are in these complicated politics. And there's a very real world impact for the people of Ukraine.
Reaching back to a phrase from a different era, arsenal of democracy. Patrick McHenry also told me when I asked him, I said, should the death of Alexei Navalny encourage or expedite or create greater political momentum behind aid for Ukraine? He said it should. It definitely should. It should send a signal to the holdouts in the House Republican Conference that the United States, the West, is up against something that is much darker than you are currently assuming. Do you have any sense that this tragic event that has sort of galvanized world attention on Putin again in a very negative way could have a larger political impact? I
think it makes it more uncomfortable, certainly for some of the Republican senators and some congressmen who had created problems in the passage of that $95 billion supplemental that went through the Senate and is stuck in Congress right now. But what you heard, and McHenry, you could tell how annoyed he was in that conversation with you. He knows that and would argue the votes are there. The majority of Republicans are there. It's stuck at the top. It's stuck at the Speaker's office and not putting this forward. You can go through those obscure methods and discharge petitions and the like to try to bypass the Speaker. But ultimately, the death of Alexei Navalny just underscores how emboldened Vladimir Putin apparently feels in this moment in time to be able to, as the U.S. would suggest, take out one of his biggest political threats, who was in a penal colony and not exactly about to rise to office, but still a threat in undermining his legitimacy. Another point coming out of that Munich Security Conference is this quote these European leaders are pointing back to, saying this feels like a 1930s moment of an emboldened Vladimir Putin, the United States going back to isolationism, not necessarily being fully on board with providing the financial wherewithal to turn the tide here. And at this moment in time where it feels very uncomfortable. And that interview with Tucker Carlson that Vladimir Putin did recently, he mentioned Poland 30 times. He pointed again and again and again back at NATO. So this idea that somehow... Echoes of
World War II, for sure.
Exactly. And it's causing those in the national security space to be very concerned. And for those pundits who want to say that foreign policy doesn't matter to U.S. elections, someone hasn't told Donald Trump that, because in virtually every Trump speech these days, he's talking a lot about NATO, isn't he?
He certainly is.
Certainly thinks people care.
Scott, I want to ask you about other developments that might be in front of the House Republicans in the not-too-distant future. Continued testimony gathered about an inquiry into a possible impeachment of the president and a confidential witness, all of that. Can you wrap some of that up? And I know you had a conversation with a Democratic member of the House who has very strong opinions about what's happening.
Oh, the twists and turns of Alexander Smirnov, Major. He was to be a backbone of this Republican effort to have an impeachment inquiry into President Biden. He had told the FBI there was some scheme between the president, his son Hunter, and Ukraine to enact bribes or pocket bribe money. He's no longer the backbone of this impeachment inquiry. He could be the undoing of it. He's not only charged with making false statements by the feds about President Biden and his son, he's now raising questions about whether he's connected to Russian intelligence and whether this is a misinformation campaign by Russian intelligence agents to mess with the 2024 election. We spoke with Republicans today who say they will proceed ahead, that their whole impeachment inquiry is not based on Alexander Smirnov. Democrats say this thing's got to end, that this should be a death knell to any inquiry. Here's Dan Goldman from New York.
The time for asking inquisitive questions was finished about a year ago. And now the Republicans are using an official committee of the Congress, in fact, several official committees, to simply do partisan bidding for Donald Trump that is being pushed and supported by Vladimir Putin and Russia.
Major, this was to be a landmark day in the probe. They brought the president's brother James here to Capitol Hill for questioning behind closed doors. Instead of talking about that, they're answering questions about Alexander Smirnov. And I'll tell you this, from being outside that room all day, Jim Jordan, top Republican on the House Judiciary Committee, left hours early, didn't even stay for the end of James Biden's interview.
Scott McFarland on Capitol Hill, Margaret Brennan here at the desk with me. Thank you both so very much. And by the way, that interview with Patrick McHenry was from my podcast, The Takeout. You can listen to this week's episode of The Takeout right now. Put it ahead 2 days early. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. President Biden is out west fundraising. We will check in on his re-election campaign. That is next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. President Biden is in California, where he spoke about his administration's latest student debt forgiveness plan. 153,000 borrowers will soon receive emails to inform them that their debts have been forgiven. The total debt to be forgiven, $1.2 billion. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes joins us from a library in Culver City where the president made that announcement. Nancy, how does this work?
The way this works, Major, and it's good to see you, is that about 150,000 Americans who took out student loans on the order of $12,000 or less and have been paying it off for more than 10 years would see the lingering debt simply forgiven. And this gets added to hundreds of thousands of other Americans who have already experienced student loan forgiveness because they qualified in other ways. This is part of a promise that the president made before he even took office to tackle student debt. He's not tackling it the way he wanted to, with a much more massive sweeping program. Instead, he's doing it piece by piece because the Supreme Court threw out his last plan. But this is the latest piece he's unveiling today, and we're told there will be more down the road.
And Nancy, does the White House believe this particular approach, unlike the one invalidated by the Supreme Court, can withstand legal scrutiny?
Yes, this is a different process. They are using authority that they already have, but that's why you're seeing it rolled out in a piecemeal fashion, because they have to figure out which programs qualify, whose debt they can forgive and whose they can't, and it's a more laborious process. And instead of being a program that runs in the hundreds of billions of dollars, it's more targeted. It is less costly. It's also less grand than the president had wanted. He sees this as a major issue, the student debt that people get buried under right when they're starting out their lives, before they even know what they want to do as a career. But it is notable that he's able to do this at all, given the setback that the administration encountered at the hands of the Supreme Court.
And Nancy, every president goes to California for policy reasons. It's a big state, lots of population, lots of things happening. But almost all presidents also stop to raise money there. The president will be in San Francisco tonight after fundraisers in Los Angeles. What's the news on the president's re-elections campaign, fundraising, and how it positions them for what's ahead?
Right. You definitely come here to California because of the deep pockets and the big fundraisers. So the president has 4 of them here in California. He had 1 last night in Los Angeles. He's got 3 coming up in San Francisco tonight and tomorrow. And this comes on the heels of what the Biden team says was a record month in January, where they raised $42 million. It's really picking up as the November elections draw closer. They say they now have $130 million cash on hand, which is a record for a Democratic candidate at this point in the cycle, and puts them up about 3-1 over the Trump team. So it really highlights some of the struggles that the Trump campaign has had with fundraising in the face of his mounting legal bills.
And Nancy, on Friday, there will be an announcement from the White House about sanctions against Russia. Do we know anything more about that? And clearly the date is significant, a 2-year anniversary.
Right. It comes just before the 2-year anniversary of Russia invading Ukraine. And we do know some details. We know that these sanctions are going to be aimed at the defense sector. We know that they're going to be aimed at the parts of the economy that fund the war effort. So think perhaps oil and gas, raises a lot of money for the ongoing war effort. We know that the White House has been in close communication with U.S. allies in Europe because they are also unveiling their own sanctions in a coordinated fashion timed to this 2-year anniversary, but also meant to send a strong signal to Vladimir Putin in the wake of the death of Alexei Navalny.
Nancy Cordes for us in California. Thank you so very much. Some of former President Trump's allies are planning to promote an agenda that's more closely aligned with religion if Trump returns to the White House. Next, what kind of policies might that bring? You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Some of former President Trump's closest allies are planning to infuse, quote, Christian nationalism and their ideas into that administration if, in fact, the former president secures a second term. These efforts are being spearheaded by a gentleman named Russell Vogt. Not necessarily a household name, but someone who's important. He was Trump's former director of the Office of Management and Budget. Vogt is now the president of something called the Center for Renewing America. It's a think tank. Alex Ward joins us now. He's a national security reporter with Politico. He is also the author of a brand new book just out this week, The Internationalists, The Fight to Restore American Foreign Policy After Trump. Alex, great to see you. Congratulations on the book. We'll get to that in a minute, I promise. What is your reporting on the intentions of Russell Vogt and those around him and Christian nationalism and a potential second Trump term?
So Russell Vogt, as you noted, runs the Center for Renewing America, and that is a Trump-aligned think tank. He's a former Office of Management and Budget director, and Russ is part of this constellation of actors that are preparing Trump and everyone around him for a second term. Now, Russ is close to a bunch of so-called Christian nationalists who most basically put, there's a lot of debate about it, but most basically put are folks who believe that Christianity should infuse almost every aspect of public life. In other words, the religion is a major part of deciding which laws get passed, which laws should be considered.
And should inform policy.
Correct.
Whether it's regulatory policy, whether it's things that the government either incentivizes or disincentivizes. And there are all sorts of mechanisms by which the government at the federal level can do both.
Right. And that's right. And one thing that Russ has said explicitly is when considering someone's immigration status to the United States, they should think about whether or not they are a Christian or follow biblical teachings as opposed to where they come from or not. So this is something that CRA is working on. It is one of many bullet points that they've been thinking about. Others are invoking the Insurrection Act on day one or doing other interesting.
Alex, I've also heard things that have come out from this think tank about divorce, about single motherhood, about contraception. What have you heard? What have you learned?
Yes, that's some of the things that they're interested in and that folks close to Russ are interested in. So one of them would be banning same-sex marriage. Others would be potentially ending access to contraceptives or ending abortion altogether. Another one that's become increasingly popular is ending no-fault divorce. So no couple is allowed to get divorced unless one can prove fault or cheating or something like that. Also, in one general thought that's been out there is having the government force fathers to take care of their children if they've proven to not do anything wrong necessarily. So it's a bit of an intrusion of government into personal life.
But it also sounds to me, Alex, like a kind of rewinding of the great reel of American nostalgia back to something around the early 20th century, or maybe even earlier than that.
Well, it's more in their mind. They will not say we're not trying to establish a theocracy. It's just that America is a Christian nation built on Christian values, right? Some of these folks would like to see the Ten Commandments in public schools, stuff like that. And so in this case, what they're thinking about is how can a Christian worldview inform public policy? And I should note, a Christian worldview is not partisan necessarily. There's a conservative view, a more centrist view, a liberal view. This is a strictly conservative, somewhat hardline conservative Christian view.
Now to your book. Are there any internationalists left in the Republican Party?
Yes, there are some. The question is, would they serve in a second Trump term? And it doesn't seem that likely. Perhaps a Robert O'Brien, who was the last national security advisor, he's still around. But mostly it is a lot of MAGA folks, more restrainers looking inward. Some would call them nationalists.
Is isolationist too strong a word to describe them? In the Trump orbit?
Yes, it is, because they are still willing to do things in the world. For example, perhaps bombing Mexico, drug cartels in Mexico, going after terrorists abroad, just because they don't necessarily want to entangle America into foreign wars or necessarily get much closer to allies and have America do what it wants in the world, regardless of everyone else, doesn't necessarily mean that they are isolationist.
And from your research for the book, there's this conversation that you can be an internationalist and not be for lengthy entanglements of America and prolonged wars. You can be someone who's in favor of global alliances and shared values and not be for endless wars. But for the Trump MAGA wing, it's like, no, if you're for international alliances, you're probably for long-term, maybe open-ended wars.
Well, what in their mind it is, if you are for something that doesn't immediately benefit or seem to immediately benefit America first and foremost.
Transactional.
Exactly. It's very transactional. So even just Trump's discussions about NATO, right? If you are not paying enough for your own defense, then maybe America won't come to defend you if, say, Russia were to attack, even though you are a NATO ally and we are treaty bound to do so.
Taking the orientation toward international assistance, which has long been given as a gift or an aid from the United States as a loan. Well, you got to pay it back. Maybe not immediately, maybe not on really tough terms, but you got to pay it back. Changing that orientation.
Absolutely. And actually, I've talked to Lindsey Graham about this, who has been a proponent of it. And when he's talked to me, he said, actually, this is a way you get people to be involved in international politics because, right, every Americans understand you give a loan, you get it paid back. Well, if people are unhappy that we give loans to certain countries and they don't see any immediate benefit, well, they'll see the immediate benefit of getting that money back at some unidentified future date. Now, you'll have others say, no, that's not why we're doing it. We're doing it because America needs its money back.
And I've heard this on Capitol Hill many times. Why do we give money to people who hate us? This idea of we're just sort of suckers. And former President Trump plays on that idea that if we're giving out this money, somehow we're losing in the transaction.
Right. I mean, in Trump's worldview, anything that doesn't seem like America gets the ultimate benefit is wrong. Some would question his views on this. I mean, it is true that we've given foreign aid and done to some entities that have not gone to our benefit. It is true that we've done some stupid stuff in the world. But some would say Trump misses that you give aid to certain places so that people have better lives. That country does better overall, and that becomes a more peaceful place that maybe America doesn't have to worry about down the line.
The long-term benefits, many have argued, Republican, Democrat, and others, that soft power can be not only persuasive, but valuable over the horizon. Alex Ward, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much. The White House Historical Association has unveiled its 2024 official Christmas ornament. This year's ornament honors the 39th president. Take a look. President Carter becomes the first living president to see the White House honor his legacy through an ornament. The ornament is shaped like an anchor in recognition of Carter's service in the United States Navy. It also pays tribute to Carter's time as a peanut farmer and displays a globe as a reminder of Carter's lifelong commitment to the environment and world peace. That does it for today. We will be back, I promise you, with another excellent edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. Here's my cheeky reminder. You're streaming CBS News.